Hello, I'm Lucy from Cruickshanks. I'm here today to review the first book that I have read from the Women's Prize Longlist 2022. On our channel, we are attempting to read our way through the entire long list before the shortlist comes out on April 27th. So if you're reading along with any of them or you'd love to have a chat, please do stick around, subscribe. I'm always up for a chat about what you're reading. So the first book that I read from the long list was Careless by Kirsty Capes, a book that I had never heard of before it was on the long list, completely not on my radar at all. But when I read the premise, I was like, oh, do you know what? That is up my street. And I'm pleased to say I'm off to a flying start with this long list because I loved it. I really, really liked this book a lot. It has so much going for it. It tells the story of 15-year-old Bess. She is in the foster care system in the UK and she finds herself pregnant. It's kind of a coming of age story for Bess. She is this really vibrant character, but one who is intensely lonely and very unhappy in her situation. Her foster placement is long term, so she's been there, I think it's 10 years, but she still doesn't feel like she belongs. She has a really tense relationship with her foster mother, who is completely infuriatingly devoid of all empathy whatsoever. She's really distant from her foster father. She doesn't really have much of a relationship with him. And although she, likes her foster sister, who is actually the biological child of the foster parents, her younger sister, she is acutely aware of the differences between them and how the love that Clarissa receives is unconditional and the love that Bess receives is incredibly conditional. And that puts an enormous weight on her. And is really, really brutal from a reader perspective, just to see those differences and to feel them through Beth's perspective, because the whole book is in Beth's perspective. Do you know what? The example that I think of is when she describes as being expensed. So when she was younger, she used to get taken on these days out and she thought that they were, like a representation of love. But actually then she discovered that when they got back from all these trips, the receipts were saved and she was expensed back to the government, and like that crushing realization that actually, she was a transaction and there's like a financial balance and all these like things being weighed off. It's really brutal from a reader perspective. And it's this loneliness and this desperateness to belong that drives Bess into the arms of Boy. She meets him after he crashes his car into the church and then steals her bicycle in order to escape. And it says on the back of the book, this is not a love story, and it is very much not. But at the beginning of the book, it kind of lulls you into thinking that just possibly it might be, because Bess is consumed by Boy in the way that, teenage romances so often go. This bubble of, intimacy and just all-consuming emotions when you are in that teenage state of first love. But obviously it goes a bit wrong because he knocks her up. And then the story is sort of what happens next. Bess has this wonderful relationship with her best friend, Ishal, who has her own issues going on. She is about to enter sort of the process to start an arranged marriage, and she's very she's in denial about how much she doesn't want this to happen. So there's like this tension and this really complex female friendship where they really truly would do anything for each other, but also, again, in the way that teenagers are fundamentally quite selfish and self-consumed because they're worrying about their own lives and their own problems. And these girls have enormous problems. And I think the friendship between them is a real strength of this book. Another thing that I really liked, a massive strength, was the setting. So it is very, very British. We are in Surrey, in the you know, sort of the green belt. But we're in a council estate for Bess, and Ishao lives in like a much more wealthy, well-to-do suburb. It's also in the 90s, and it is so incredibly British 90s. Like, the setting is bang on. I was a teenager in the 90s, a little bit behind Bess, but it's so recognisable for me. It had like this really hugely nostalgic feel, particularly at the start of the novel. You know, when you're getting lulled into this, you know, burgeoning love story in this era, in this, you know, part of the world that was so recognisable to me, you sort of like get this warm feeling like, oh, do you know, this is actually quite nice, I'm quite enjoying this, and then bam, because it is not nice and it is not enjoyable, it is brutal, the turns that this novel takes. I mean, like, there are scenes that are really, really uncomfortable, you know, harrowing, genuinely. And I think probably not really represented in the cover, because, you know, that feels quite cheerful to me, but it is dark. There are some really dark turns in this book. And you realise that it's not a love story in any way, shape or form. Boy, I think, would be intensely recognisable for a lot of people. The older boy that is, you know, Bess is infatuated with, and as the book progresses, he becomes more and more problematic in quite a predictable way, but it, you know, it doesn't feel predictable because of the way that, you know, the story is told. It's still incredibly satisfying, and disappointing and heartbreaking, because you want him to do better, and inevitably he does not. The style in which it's written is very accessible. It's clean. It, you know, is not overly literary. It's not going to be a struggle to read or put anyone off. The only, I guess, quirk is that there are no speech marks in it, which has a name for that. I can't remember what it was. There's no speech marks. And sometimes I'm not a fan of that, but it didn't bother me in this book at all. Actually, I could see exactly why it's done. You know, sometimes I'm like, what's the point? What have you gained by doing this? But in this book, it totally works, because it blurs the lines between what Bess thinks and what she wants to say to people so desperately, and what she actually says. And they are worlds apart. You know, she thinks in real depth and is really articulate, you know, on the inside, and desperate to communicate. But what she comes out with as a teenager, who, you know, a troubled teenager, is not articulate, and it's very, you know, sparse, and it's brief, and you're just desperate, particularly for the adults around her, to recognise that gulf between what she thinks and what she says, and, you know, to read between the lines. And I think by not having speech marks, you know, it rolls it into one for the reader, and makes the difference more brutal, because sometimes you pause and you think, did she say that? Did she not say that? Oh, she thought it. You have like this moment of hope that she actually said what she was thinking, what she needed to say for someone to help her. And then you realise, oh, you know, hope's dashed. She didn't. She just thought it. And yet again, she came out with something that did not communicate just how desperately she needed the help. So that's kind of like the only stylistic thing, I guess, worth mentioning. I mean, that sounded really brutal, because actually the rest of it, you know, stylistically is really good. It's really well written. It's just not noteworthy. I don't know what I'm saying, but anyway, that's the only quirk. And I liked that a lot. It did work. Thematically, obviously, we're looking at the care system, the foster care system, in real depth. And, you know, this is one child's fictional experience, but, you know, which is not overly positive. It's not disastrous, but it's not overly positive. But what it's trying to tell you, I guess, is about like the systemic failures, or the systemic gaps, I think, that exist in foster care. The lack of, you know, genuine unconditional love, which to a point is understandable, but it's also really, really brutal for the child that's in it. You know, the foster parents, you know, there's lots of times when she mentions, you know, how desperately she needs a hug, but, you know, they can't hug her. they're not allowed as foster parents to give her that love. But also, you know, you can recognise how over time they no longer even, you know, feel like it's something that they have to do, how that lack of empathy like creeps in, and how systemically the way that the institutions are set up and the processes and like the churn of social workers that she gets through, and how she feels like their box ticking around her, you know, is talking about a wider system. It's not talking about this child in this the experience in this family. You know, she is making points about the care system in general, which are really, you know, they're hard. And there's all sorts of points, I think, about the teenage pregnancy, and, you know, how that is compounded by this lack of unconditional love and help around her, and lack of like a firm family structure. But I think the other big theme to look at is friendship in here, because it says it's not a love story, but it kind of is, because the love story is between Bess and Ishal, you know, her best friend, her, you know, the one person who truly gets her, you know, even though she doesn't say all these things, and you know, she can't say all these things. There is a level at which these girls get each other, and, you know, it's not a simple friendship. There are, you know, there are conflicts and there are nuances, and it's at times it's messy, and it's unbalanced. But fundamentally, that is the love story in the book, and the importance of friendship, particularly when that family structure isn't in place. So that was a really, really well done theme in this book. I always think of what books I read might be a little bit like, and there isn't like a explicit parallel, I think. You know, I haven't read many books about children in care, and I don't think I've read any that I can think of where the portrayal is ultimately so positive of the heroine, you know, because this is a really positive book for Bess. You know, she is just entirely real, and you know, not stereotypical of, you know, how often I think foster kids are portrayed in, or kids in care are portrayed in, you know, the wider media, I guess. So I couldn't think of like a parallel there. I think like the 90s nostalgia, British nostalgia bit, is maybe a bit Sweet Sorrow by David Nichols. It's kind of a little bit got that vibe, although it's a lot darker. It's definitely massively darker. And I think it's got the teeny tiniest bit of Milkman in there somewhere as well. You know, it hasn't got the real literary language, but it hasn't got the speech marks. It's got that sort of coming of age female heroine with an edge, and, you know, it's not a perfect likeness, but I can see little bits of those books in there. But, you know, it's its own thing, and one I really, really enjoyed. So I'm hoping that the other 16 books on the long list, which actually I'm not reading all by myself, my husband is helping me out with, but I hope that they live up to this one, because it was a really, really good start, and a book that I hope gets loads more coverage, and loads more exposure and loads of new readers, because I think, you know, it's a really, really worthwhile one to pick up. Excuse me. So that's it. Have you read it? Are you going to read it? Would love to know what you're up to. Careless by Kirsty Capes. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.